I first met this young woman as a sophomore in high school in New Mexico when she was a recipient of the Award for Aspirations in Computing. She continued to be in our community and then was a national award winner. We went to the Teen Choice Awards where she stood on stage talking about her work and sharing her work. She is a scientist, she's a researcher, she does computational research. She went to the White House Science Fair, a recipient of the Jefferson Award, an older sister to another young woman in computing, and just really a wonderful example of someone growing and achieving and learning and exploring and loving technology all along the way. So she'll talk about NASA, she'll talk about all kinds of things. I think it's amazing that she's actually like on staff at NASA while she's an undergrad. They just wouldn't let her go. So Sophia Sanchez-Maes.
Thank you so much. Ruth is actually one of my favorite people, so I'm so glad that she got to introduce me today. Her organization that she used to be a part of and her continued involvement with CS for All has been so helpful to me in my career, and really this gang of girls that we assembled as part of the National Center for Women in Technology Aspirations Award is just the most amazing source of strength. Because there are times when being in CS as a person who is not the usual CS is very difficult. And having those spaces where I'm reminded that even though I might be alone in a class or alone in a workplace, that I'm not really the only one is really, really important. So before I start, there is one comment that I wanted to make after this really inspiring panel that I just watched. We talk so much here about making and computer science, and here we seem to be talking about them as though they're different things, when in my experience that hasn't been the case whatsoever. Sure, making is not CS, but CS is making. Making software or hardware, just because your things are less tangible doesn't make them any less real. And I think that's really important because the way that we talk about things has a lot of power, not only in how people perceive them, but in how they are presented to students. And I think one of the best examples of this is something that Ruth was talking about to me just a little while ago, in the way that we teach math versus the way that we teach language. Because so often you'll hear people just casually telling you that it's okay that you're bad at math because they're bad at math too. And they'll say it with such aplomb, whereas you'd never hear anyone bragging in the same way about it's okay if you can't read. I also am illiterate. It's cool. Because it is just so different, and the way that we present it is different too. When I'm in the language arts class, I'm learning about nouns, I'm learning about verbs. These are the constituents that make up my sentences. We teach language arts as a creative enterprise from the start. We're there because words are the way that knowledge is communicated in this world, and so we need to read them. We're there because in order to have a voice in this world, we have to assemble sentences and create, stories, and we have stories, and this is the vehicle in which we present them, and so that's how it's taught. From the first day, you're writing things, you're making things. In math, it's not that way. You're taught to memorize structures, you're taught to memorize times tables, and that's not such an inspirational thing to do. Now, having fancied myself a mathematician, I see math a lot differently, but I didn't get the opportunity to even frame it in a way of math being a creative enterprise until I'd already finished the calc sequence and left high school. And I think that's a real detriment because it means that the people who do math are all people who liked it for reasons that aren't math. And a lot of people who might like it otherwise just might never get to the point where they know what it really is. And I think that we're doing a detriment if we make the same mistake with computer science. Computer science is creative, and computer science is making. Because really it's a tool just as important, if not more important, than any hot glue gun you'll ever own. So I am Sophia Sanchez-Maes. Thank you so much for letting me speak today, letting me be here in this incredible room of makers. I'm happy to see so many incredible faces represented from organizations that I know have made such an impact in the lives of me and many of my friends. So I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about myself. Now, there's about a billion things that I'd rather be talking about at any given moment. I could tell you about how the more stars there are in the sky, the less likely it is that any of them are going to collide. And then you'd be like, whoa, that violates all my intuition. And I could show you how mathematically I could build, on different intuition to have you understand this concept. I could show you physically with these smoothed potentials, but instead I'm talking about my potential because we have all of these problems in the classes that teach me these things, where I realized time and time again this semester and all the others that I am very lonely. In most of my classes this semester, I was the only woman, and near all of my classes this semester, I was the only person who wasn't white or Asian. So I am a Latina, and I bring that with me everywhere. I'm a scientist and a researcher, and my world line starts in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in the borderlands. The fact that I'm here, the fact that I'm a scientist at JPL, that I'm a student at Yale, is all so incredibly unlikely. And it's because of organizations that reached out to me and introduced me to these opportunities that I was able to get where I am now. Will every student who's interested in CS become a computer scientist? No. Just like every student introduced to English will not be a writer. But if a student isn't introduced to either, then they never can be. And I think that's why at least presenting every person with the opportunity is important, because I came from a place where it would have been so easy for me to have none of the opportunity. But that's not what happened. I came from a pretty poor family. The first couple years of my life, I never slept in the dark, because when my mom turned on the lights, she would see cockroaches scuttling to the corners of the room, and she was afraid that one of them would crawl onto me, and I'd choke on it in my sleep. When we finally moved out of that apartment into our first house, it was a little blue casita on Calle de Sueños, which means the street of dreams. Now, looking back on things, that seems rather metaphoric in a sense. I think when you look at your life and read it like a book, there's a lot of paths that you can see that seem so obvious and so evident and so poetic that are never quite so clear when you're living them. For instance, when I was going through photos, going through family memories with my parents and with my relatives in preparation for this talk, my mom showed me a photo of me wearing gloves, purple latex gloves, the kind you'd find in doctors' offices, and holding a tiny test tube with what she told me was a cloned plant. Because in the second grade, I got to go to the university and tell everyone at this ag conference about the life cycle of the corn earworm. And while there, they took me around a lab. They gave me this sample of a cloned plant. And I wouldn't take off those latex gloves for days. It was a health issue. My mom had to force them off my hands. And in hindsight, it's so beautiful because I have another picture that is so parallel and so unintentionally so of myself as a high schooler in a lab at the same university, wearing the same rubber gloves, and holding up a sample of the algae that I'd be using to turn into biofuels. And that was just so insanely incredible. So CS has really been a key to everything that I've been able to accomplish. I learned to code when I was just going into high school. There was an organization in my city called Young Women in Computing that was run out of the university, and they reached out to these primarily Latinas that were in the area and that were very, kind of underprivileged, and taught them to code. Now, it wasn't just that they went in and taught these skills. They made sure that they'd have the people in the room who needed them the most. And they did that by selling it not as a computer science camp, but as a cool, fun camp where I could get lunch every day, which was great, especially in the summer, and where they'd pay me a couple $100 just to go. So even for the most reluctant parents of my friends who would not otherwise have driven them every day to the university and driven them back, that was enough convincing for them to be introduced to and get all of these incredible opportunities. So I think going that extra step was really important in the lives of myself and a lot of people that I knew. I knew how to code, and it's because I knew how to code that the next year, when I was 15, I was able to get a job. When I was 15, I needed to get a job. My parents were going to get me a work permit. I was going to have to earn some money. And I was lucky enough that I got one at the Center for High Technology Materials up in Albuquerque, 4.5 hours drive away from home. So I was 15 years old and I moved. I lived with my aunt, I lived with my cousin. And it was lonely because my cousin was often sitting dogs or sitting houses, doing her own thing as a camp counselor. My aunt was very busy, working all the time. And so I remember I would take around my laptop with me around the house so I could, I could hear like Doctor Who coming out of the speakers, and the noise was better than the silence. I hated it. I really did. I was working in a physics lab. I'm a physicist now, so I'm just so surprised that any of this happened. And it was just that when I was in that place, I was absolutely isolated. I saw my mentor maybe once, and I was primarily working with a postdoc who was so kind and so helpful, but who presented the work in a rather uninspiring way. And so for me, my career in science at that point was a matter of utility. I needed to make money. I could do science. I could code, and so I didn't have to flip burgers. That's so different from the way that I see it now. Science is beautiful and incredible, and it's a way that I can discover things, but that's not how I saw physics at the time. It is how I saw biology. I was lucky enough to have a 7th grade science teacher who was basically Miss Frizzle incarnate. Her name was Mrs. Locke. She even did the outfits. We would go to the bosque on a field trip, and she'd have like sandhill crane earrings. We'd be learning about like meiosis and mitosis, and she'd wear her DNA smock. She just must have had a wardrobe full of these things. It was incredible. She's my style goals. At least going to do the earrings part in my lifetime. But she would always tell us that since she's taught life science, the most important thing was to realize that life happens outside the classroom. She told us that every single day. And so she wanted to make sure that we'd be outside the classroom too. And she took us on field trips constantly. Every month, we'd go visit the Rio Grande. It's our river in southern New Mexico, the local one. And we'd take measurements of the turbidity of the stream flow, observe whatever biota was there, and try and see what it indicated in terms of the health of the river. And it was just so much fun, splashing around in waders, making mistakes, getting messy, all of those magic frizzle bus things. And at the end of the year, of course, we had to assemble all of the data that we'd taken throughout our seasons of observation and present it to the class. Each of us had a different indicator. We could each say how things were going. And the narrative was very similar. We see a declining trend in indicators of river health, but it's only been a season. It could be a seasonal trend. That's nothing to get upset about. But Miss Locke was clever. She'd been taking these measurements for many, many years with her classes. And so rather dramatically, she revealed this entire past graph of all of these indicators where you could see these seasonal oscillations outlining this greater linear decline. And she showed us a paper from the World Wildlife Fund showing that the Rio Grande was one of the world's top 10 most endangered rivers. And she told us how crazy it was that everyone in our state and the others had rights to this water except the river itself. And we were all really surprised. The data was so obvious. It was right there. And I guess that's when I realized that these things, the science at least, had a lot of answers, and it made me care. It wasn't until later that I started trying to figure out how I would want to solve these things. At first, I thought it was policy. I thought it was just a matter of going up to Santa Fe, changing the laws, convincing some Congress people. But they've had this data for a long time. Now, in high school, after that stint at the Center for High-Tech Materials, my sister was in Miss Locke's class. And I was so excited to hear it. I wanted to hear all about their field trips, but by that time, they didn't go to the river anymore. I was so confused. I asked my sister why, and she laughed at me because I was in cross country at the time, and we ran our races in the dry river basin. 10 out of 12 months of the year, there was no water. Nothing to measure. So while politicians were still at that point debating in Santa Fe whether or not the problem really existed, this decline had taken place. And I was upset. That water had defined generations and generations of my family, the landscape where they worked and lived and existed. And it no longer flowed the way it used to. That was when I heard about another girl who was doing a project about renewable energies with solar and making this oven that was solar. I heard about other girls from ISEF who were doing things with algae. And so that entire year, I just read and read and read and tried to figure out why none of these things were happening yet. If algae biofuels were so much more productive, if these plants could produce lipids at this incredible rate and per acre, per land mass, we could have enough energy. I was surprised why we weren't all driving our cars on green gas yet. But I learned about the problems, and I wanted to solve them. And so when I finally got the opportunity to apply for a place in a lab at the university that did just that, I jumped at it, and I was ready when it came. I was really excited when I finally got that position inside the chemical engineering lab. I'd never done chemistry or really engineering before, but it was the problem that made me want to delve into the science that would find its solution. And so as a result, I ended up presenting these results to President Obama, showing him how using this hydrothermal liquefaction, putting high pressure and high temperatures, just like the center of the Earth, we could make a product that's chemically identical to the gasoline that you put in your cars. And I was so happy, I thought that was enough. But I realized that there were greater problems than this, that even in sunny New Mexico, it's very difficult to harvest and grow algae in a way that is financially non-problematic, right? It's hard to have enough water. It's hard to make sure that you're doing this in the best way possible. It's an optimization problem, really. And at that point, the only thing I knew how to do was code. And so, I had an idea of how I could sketch out a simulation of algae growth to optimize its growth within some parameters. There was a mathematical model that someone had published. Why hadn't someone computerized it, run it, given it to these startups that do exist? And so that's what I did. And since I had this idea, there were some people who were helpful enough, happy enough to help me do my best to make it happen. And so Los Alamos National Labs up north, the Supercomputing Challenge, they were all really great in making sure that I had the opportunity to pursue this crazy idea from a person who was objectively unqualified, at first at least, to embark upon that trajectory. Everything that I've done, it seems like at the time I was objectively unqualified to do it, but the fact that someone took a chance and let me allowed me to grow into whatever space I put myself in. And I see that as a big lesson now, especially. The only reason I got to NASA was that I was able to apply with a university transcript. The only reason I had a university transcript was because at the time, my school district mandated that if someone had expired the course offerings in an area, they would pay completely for tuition and books at the university to continue studies. My sister's in the same place now, and since it's an established program, it has so much more regulation and overhead on it that it's actually impossible for her to do the same things that I did before. So even as we're trying to create and entrench these routes of accessibility, I think it's important to ensure that they remain flexible, because that's kind of the point. Everyone's a little bit different, and We have to teach that way too. So when I did go, try to find my job at NASA, I was just looking for another tech job. It was going to be the summer after I graduated high school, and so I went to the university career fair, hoping that I could find something. And it's funny looking back now, because I still have a copy of the resume that I used. And it had 4 different colors on it. It's purple, blue, orange, and black. And instead of bullet points, it had little suns. So I remember I was so proud of it. I thought it was so cool and so groovy looking. And I showed my grandpa, and he laughed at me. And he told me that there was no way that any sane person was going to hire me to do an actual work job. It's like, it's okay, you can just apply online later. Like, you'll realize once you go. And so off I went with my 4-color resumes, telling everyone about the things that I'd done. And some people were less than impressed about the way that I decided to present myself. But NASA thought it was kind of cool. They liked that I could code, because that was the one thing that made me useful to them. It was all very well that I could do lots of interesting higher mathematics, but the thing that applied was the fact that I could make software. So that was really cool. I think that if I was, an actual university sophomore, the equivalent of whatever my transcript says, I might not have gotten that same job. I think there is something about my youth that gave me a leg up in a lot of these circumstances. I wasn't exceptional for their applicant pool, but I was exceptional for my age and the fact that I was there at all. And so I think it's important to admit that that was, an odd sort of advantage in a way. The fact that the necessity drove me there is another thing that I can thank in sort of this convoluted manner for where I am now. But go I did. I was 17 years old, and I moved to LA to start an internship at NASA, where I was going to write code for the Mars rover, which is super sick. That's amazing. I was so excited. I'd gotten a couple of offers. I remember one was from like a defense industry firm that wanted me to write the software that would distinguish between the school buses and the military targets. I'm like, I don't want to touch that. That is too morally heavy. I am young. I don't know what that will actually be used for. Another one was a tech firm, and I was, debating with one of my friends, and I remember he told me, Sophia, you have a literally out-of-this-world option. What are you doing? And so I went to NASA, and it's been the place I can't shake, really. It is such an incredible opportunity for me to learn things and work on things in a collaborative way, because they see things as there. They employ scientists like me, but they employ historians too. They have a whole team of artists whose only job is to create spaces that'll enhance the curiosity of the scientists and of the public. And that's something that I haven't found anywhere else. And that's, I think, what makes this work environment so magical, is that you have this exchange of ideas across disciplines and across platforms, and that's how we're able to do these incredible things, dare these mighty things. And so, in all of my studies, the things that I've been able to do, the things that I've been able to create, have been a result of being a bit of a jack of all trades. I can speak math, I can speak code, I can speak these disparate disciplines of science. And so often, when I'm back at school, I see these disciplines speaking past each other, speaking different languages, doing things while not necessarily being limited by, observations, or not necessarily being aware of what we can do in a different aspect. Now I work in exoplanets. I don't do Mars anymore. I get to study all of the planets around stars that aren't our sun. So when you look up, statistically speaking, every one of those points of light has some worlds around it. The first time I started working with exoplanets, I was trying to find little Earths. I was trying to whisper out the signal of the stellar activity and find the signal of the tiny planet. And it was fun. Back in the day, my field is about as old as I am. We discovered our first planet about 20 years ago. I guess that was what makes it fun to innovate there, is because everything is kind of a revolution. We don't understand anything. When I realized that in those 20 years we discovered thousands of planets. 20 years ago, we were a solar system alone in the universe with a complete theory of planetary formation, only because we were working with the sample size of one. And every planet we discovered broke more and more aspects of our theory and our preconceptions. And it was incredible. But now we have thousands of planets. And we have thousands of planets with masses, with radii, with orbital parameters. We see them indirectly in the way that they impact the gravity of their star. We see them indirectly in the way that they impact the light of their star. But we don't see them as worlds, right? We don't see them as complete worlds with unique geologies, and that's kind of where things took me next. I became a bit of a geophysicist for a time so that I could try and figure out what parameters of these planets we could ever hope to observe from 20 light years away. And I was able to show that surface water seen in the spectra of a planet, which we'll probably be able to get within the next 20 or so years with the new missions, can be indicative of plate tectonics, which is really what separates Earth from Venus. It's what makes life possible in a weird, convoluted way. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm here to talk to you about how I got where I am and why I do what I do, and how I got from a place where coding was a utility, was a tool, to a place where coding was my tool, and asking and answering questions was the thing I loved the most in the world. And that's a huge jump. And it's a jump that I only made because I had such incredible teachers and because I needed it so badly, right? Because it's not easy to go into this space looking like me, being just different in a lot of different dimensions than most people in the space, and trying to make a place for myself because I didn't see it. It's hard to explain. It was easier in high school. It really was. I had programs like Young Women in Computing. I had amazing programs like NCWIT, which hooked me to thousands and thousands of other girls who were doing the same thing across the country. I had support from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, who showed me that other people of color were also doing this, incredible stuff. And it gave me a bit of perspective that took me out of the town where my family hadn't really left in the last 400, 500 years, and allowed me to gain that broader perspective. I think that was important. Now, I know a lot of these organizations innovate at the middle school and high school level because they have statistics supporting that that's where we lose women and people of color. Girls are really into CS, but then in middle school, somehow they drop off. And so it's really important that we teach them there, that we target them there so that they stay on longer. But I think there's a bit of a drop-off in the way that we support students after that, because our statistics now are just not going to be representative of the fact that if they drop out later, maybe it's because they never got that far before. And I think I realized that most when I got to college. I go to Yale University, and that school has so many incredible resources to make incredible things happen, and that's certainly been the case in my career. But it also has a lot of kind of entrenched institutional biases, right? It was at Yale that just 2 weeks ago, another person of color was reported to the police for just being in her dorm. This isn't the first time. It happened to her friend, too. And so it's something that you see in a lot of convoluted ways that you wouldn't quite expect. When I started at Yale, I decided I was going to take the intensive introductory physics class. It was the one that everyone said you had to take if you were serious about anything at all. See, those are the kinds of things that people say when you go to a place like Yale. And so I sat there, and on the first day, I remember the class gender ratio was about 50-50. And the professor handed out a paper with mathematical equations that you needed to understand, or else you know where the door is. He listed a series of physics classes that you should have taken, otherwise this wasn't the place for you. And people left. I understood the math, but in all of my time, I'd never taken physics. My high school didn't offer physics. And so at the end of class, like so many other students, I asked him if I belonged there. And his answer was no. Fine. But where should I go? Look, I have all this math. I don't have any physics. And I remember his words, which weren't intended as such, did stick with me for a long time. He said, "There's no place for you here." And I know he meant that there wasn't a physics class that corresponded to my weird background. But it really hurt. And I remember I stuck in a class that I probably shouldn't have been in, just because I knew that the people who stuck around were going to be the professors for people later on, right? And if they also thought it was normal not to have any women, not to have any minorities in that space, then some other generation was going to have a professor just like mine who would say something with just as much carelessness. And I think that's the hard part that no one ever told me would happen. The hard part is being in a space and having to prove you're supposed to be there before you're able to get to work. And it's the burden of feeling like you're representing, a burden that I shouldn't have, but a burden that I feel, that causes me to go into a lot of these, it causes me to push myself. It certainly advanced me over where I would have been otherwise, but it's also really stressful and it's really isolating. It's why I'm here, right? It's why I'm talking to you about the importance of maker education, which necessarily includes CS. It's because organizations like yours are the reason why I can even talk to you today, right? It's the reason that I've done what I've done, gotten as far as I have. But I think that those are important things to think about, that even after the extent of your programs and the extent of your outreach stops, people's lives continue, right? And there are other convoluted mechanisms of institutionalized biases that they're going to have to brave and fight. And I think, that's why the NCWIT community has been so important to me, is because they're growing up through it just like I am. And that's been really good, because when I feel those things, when I'm in those situations, I know that I have a base of support. Now, there's other weird ways, too, that being alone in a class can impact you. I know I missed class one day in a math class, and my professor felt the need to come and talk to me. He was so worried that I'd missed. And I knew for a fact that the guys in my class were periodically not coming, but he couldn't ever recognize which one of them was absent. But I was the only woman there, so when I wasn't there, it was just so obvious. Every math class that I've taken at Yale, since I'm in a lot of higher math, I've always had the professor take me aside for a meeting on the first day, to ask to set up a meeting with me. And at first, I thought it was because maybe everyone else in the class had already scheduled their presentation topic or something else. But it's because they're concerned. And it comes from a good place, a good intent on their part, I believe, that they don't want me to put myself in a position where I'm setting myself up for failure. My math background, of course, wasn't classes taken at Yale, and so they feel obligated to ensure that I do have the necessary skills. But it is frustrating when every time, I go into these spaces, it is me being asked to prove these things. And just my being who I am and looking how I do is the mechanism on which that concern is applied, which is an object of infinite frustration. So I guess those are, some of my stories. Most of them are happy, really. I've been able to have the support that I need to do incredible work. I've been able to have the privilege of reaching back down as I'm climbing up. Through NCWIT, I got an Aspire IT grant so that I could teach women of color in Southgate and Compton to code, and they all did really incredible projects that I was just blown away by. One wanted to make an app where you could take photos of lost dogs that you saw on the street, and other people on the app who'd lost their dogs would put photos of their dogs, and like the AI would try to she wanted to do an AI. We didn't get that far, but the idea was incredible, and her implementation was really cute. Would match up the faces of the dogs and connect the people, which I thought was so cool. Another one made an app that was supposed to help dreamers at her school find each other and make communities, which was really amazing. And so in that program, I tried to do exactly what Young Women in Computing had done for me all those years before. And I think it's important, because I know that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for things exactly like that. And so, I owe y'all a debt of gratitude for the work that you're doing in this space, because it is so important. Not everyone is going to do what I did and, become an innovator in a scientific and technical field, but everyone deserves the chance. And I think that's what we're really fighting for, because the people who are losing out are always going to be marginalized people of color in poorer communities, who won't otherwise get the chance. They're the ones for which we even talk about an either or, and that's where I'm from, right? That's what I saw, that's what I see. And it's funny now, because coming home is just such an incredible dichotomy from the kind of intellectual, social, and material privilege that I'm inundated with at school and in my job. That just the conversations are so much different. When I go back home, the object of conversation is a lot more immediate, right? Things aren't abstract because they happen. And I think that's one thing that we should be aware of in spaces like this especially, is that we're talking for a lot of people who aren't here, and they're real folks. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, I think I have 3 minutes.
Hi. I'm really nervous to ask you this question. At first I wanted to ask you something like, are you okay? And then I realized that would be a really uncool thing to ask you. But my question is really how do you take care of yourself, right? Outside of your professional space? What are you doing to maintain your sanity in a space of loneliness?
Yeah, no, that's so important. And I think that I'm privileged in a way that a lot of people aren't, because my family is just incredible. They are so close and so unconditionally loving and supportive. And, I call my mom and my father, I call them daily. I call my sisters daily. I call my grandparents daily. And that's a lot of people to call daily, but they all live across the street from each other, so they just hand the phone around, because that's how it is. And so it is hard being separated from them and feeling lonely because you're not at family dinner crowded into that tiny little house every day. But they're still there for me, and they're still in my corner. And I have people who I've met at school who are the same way. I have people and professors who are so supportive and believe in me. And I have amazing friends, and I think that's the way that I keep perspective and I keep sane, is I keep connected to those groups. But I also realize that I'm really lucky, because my family situation of just that incredible closeness and support is not universal. So thank you so much.